Hello to everyone. It's a pleasure to have Georg Schiemer today with us. He is a professor at the University of Vienna, so Department of Philosophy, and he's also head of the Institute of Vienna Circle, always at the University of Vienna. His specialization is in history and philosophy of mathematics, early analytic philosophy. Topics are logic, history, and philosophy of logic, formal, and philosophy of science. Georg led a couple of interesting projects, which are the ERC project. The last one was on the roots of mathematical structuralism, and if I am correct, now he's leading also another one on the formal turn, so the emergence of formalism in 20th century thought. Georg published a whole bunch of super interesting stuff, at least for me. So they range from mathematical structuralism, formalism. Authors are Hilbert, Carnap, Cassirer, and similar. So today, his talk is on from Hilbert's program to Carnap's Wissenschaftslogik. Okay, so join me to welcome Georg Schiemer.
Okay, thanks a lot. Well, Katharina and Luca, thanks to both of you for this kind invitation and
thanks
for
to you.
Possibility to speak. Can you hear me fine? Is everything working still?
Yes, Georg. Please
Perfect.
go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, great. So yes, my talk is on it's work in progress, and it's on a comparison between Hilbert and Carnap, or a study of the Hilbertian background of Carnap's work in logic, but then also in what he called Wissenschaftslogik, so the logic of science. And it's work in progress. As I said, it's I have no paper yet, and I'm very curious to hear what you think about this. Yeah, maybe so. Let me start by making some quite general remarks on formalism, or the formal turn in the 20th century, basically. So I take it that logic, but also the foundations of mathematics and philosophy of science in the early 20th century is characterized by a quite general and widespread idea and adoption of formalist or instrumentalist views, so instrumentalist approaches. And the project that Luca just mentioned is the formal turn project, an ERC project in Vienna, is basically focuses on this quite general phenomenon, namely the emergence of formalist views in the early 20th century. And the aim, overall broad aim, is to analyze how these kind of historical developments within logic, within debates on the foundations of mathematics, but also in philosophy of science are related. Today, my focus is, as I said, on a comparison between Hilbert and Carnap, and a bit more specifically on the question whether there are links between Hilbert's instrumentalist account of logic and mathematics and Carnap's Wissenschaftslogik, so Carnap's logic of science. Well, one issue is here, of course, what's meant by formalism or by instrumentalism, and this is a quite general and elusive notion, or difficult to pin down. So at least in the context of philosophy of mathematics, it's usually taken to be the view that mathematics is purely syntactic in character, and that semantic concepts are either not relevant at all, or if relevant, they are somehow reducible to syntactic ones. this is a very general characterization, even within the context of philosophy of mathematics. What I would like to focus on here is a kind of more specific type of formalism that has sometimes been called instrumental formalism, especially in the context of Hilbert's work. And this is basically a focus on an instrumentalist uses of language in logic and in philosophy of science. So an emphasis on what Michael Detlefsen in one of his articles has called a non-representational role of language, or non-referential uses of signs or symbols in mathematical reasoning. So it's this kind of specific subtype of formalism, call it instrumental formalism, that I'm mainly interested in the context of this project. And as is well known, and as people like Detlefsen and many others have emphasized, Hilbert's work from the 20s and 30s is really a culmination point on this account of formalism, I would say. So here a couple of quotes. One is by Detlefsen this is from his long paper on the historical development of formalism from at least from the 19th century mathematics until Hilbert, basically. And Detlefsen in his article characterizes this instrumentalist account as follows. So he also calls it the Bergelian conception of language in algebra, and he says this: the instrumentalist conception of language allows for purely symbolic uses of signs in a reasoning, uses that do not depend in any essential way on the semantic content of the signs involved, or on their even having such content. So I think this is the kind of instrumentalism in the context of mathematics that's clearly relevant here. And then the second quote is from Psilos, on a philosopher of science, on instrumentalism in the sciences. And he has a kind of similar account of what he calls syntactic instrumentalism, which is ascribed to Carnap and others. And he says that, now this is in the context of philosophy of science, theoretical statements and terms are merely syntactic constructs without truth values or reference. So again, a kind of interesting instrumentalist viewpoint in philosophy of science. Now, the specific question that I'm interested in today concerns the influence on Hilbert on Carnap, and the questions: to what extent was Hilbert's Wissenschaftslogik, so especially his views on logical theory reconstruction, influenced or motivated by Hilbert's program? So Hilbert's work from the 20s and 30s, roughly. And the second kind of specific question is Hilbert's mathematical instrumentalism comparable in some sense to Carnap's account of theoretical languages, of scientific languages? So these are the two questions that I at some point would like to address or answer in this paper. So here's an outline of the talk. I will first make some very brief remarks on Hilbert's program and on his instrumentalism, and basically give you some quotes from the scholarly literature on this. And then secondly, turn to Carnap and there talk about 3 or 4 points of contact between Carnap's work and Hilbert's work, or 3 influences that one can identify. And then finally, a 4th and more direct influence in Carnap's work concerns this so-called epsilon reconstruction of scientific theory. So I will say a little bit about how Carnap used Hilbert's epsilon logic and epsilon terms for a definition, an explicit definition of theoretical terms. Yeah, so this is the outline. So let's start with Hilbert. And all I will say here is well known, so there's no claim to originality here. So I just give you a kind of an overview of what Hilbert's program is and how other philosophers what other philosophers have said about it. So, as is well known, Hilbert's program is based on the idea that one can divide mathematics into two parts, an interpreted finitary core, a part of contentful, inhaltlich is the German term, mathematics, and then secondly, theories of higher classical mathematics, which are formal in a way. And then the program is really based on 2 or 3 steps. The first one is the axiomatization of these higher theories of classical mathematics and their logical formalization. And then, and of course, the axiomatization part is rooted in Hilbert's work on Hilbert's work at the turn of the last century on the axiomatic foundations of geometry, Euclidean geometry, and analysis or real number fields. So this is the first part, and the second main part is then to the different attempts to give consistency proofs by finitary means for these formal theories of classical mathematics. And what's, I think, in the present context is really interesting is that at some point in the 20s, second half of the 20s, but there's also, you also find it in 23, I think, Hilbert cashes out this approach in terms of a distinction between real and ideal statements in mathematics. So, for instance, in this famous paper on the infinite, 1926, he says, we conceive mathematics to be a stock of 2 kinds of formulas. First, those to which the meaningful communication of finitary statements correspond. So this is the contentful finitary part. And secondly, other formulas which signify nothing and which are the ideal structures, or Gebilde is the German term, of the theory. So there is a clear distinction between ideal statements or ideal formulas which are taken to be formal and which are for which Hilbert uses kind of logical symbols such as the quantifiers or the epsilon symbol, and on the other hand, there are the real statements which are inhaltlich, contentful, and which are verifiable, verifizierbar. And what's interesting for the present comparison with Carnap is I think that Hilbert's program has often been described as a kind of instrumentalist, as an instrumentalist project. So the idea that you really have a finitary contentful part, some form of elementary number theory, and then a part of mathematics which is a meaningless formalism, and one can be kind of an instrumentalist about this part of mathematics, based, of course, on the central kind of condition that Hilbert specifies, namely that the use of formal mathematics needs to be justified metatheoretically in terms of a consistency proof or in terms of a conservativity proof. So in one reading of Hilbert's program is as a kind of conservativity program. That is the idea to prove the conservativity over ideal mathematics over real mathematics. And the basic idea is that, at least in the later part, is an idea in proof transformation. So the idea is to eliminate the ideal elements. So this is the analogy with 19th century mathematics, really, is to eliminate ideal elements, which are the epsilon symbols, essentially, in the proof or in the derivation of real statements. Yes, and the kind of formal logical framework for this, especially in Hilbert's later work, in Hilbert and Bernay's second volume of Foundations of Mathematics, these conservativity results that are given there, the epsilon theorems, are based on his famous epsilon calculus. And this is an extension of the language of predicate logic by such an epsilon symbol, which is a term-forming operator. So if you have a formula in that language, A, with X, a free variable, then this thing here is an epsilon term, so it's a term-forming operator that is motivated or introduced semantically, really, as a term that picks out one arbitrary element in this set A, if there is one. So it's interpreted semantically as a choice function, one could say. I won't discuss the system, the axioms. So this is basically one axiom scheme, the critical formulas axiom scheme. And with this, one can define the quantifiers. And in the mentioned 1939 book, Grundlagen der Mathematik, Hilbert and Bernay actually give what they call a general consistency theorem based on two central conservativity results. This is why I mentioned conservativity before, and these are the first and second epsilon theorem, which basically show that the epsilon calculus is a conservative extension of this quantifier-free part of the predicate calculus. The person who has, there's one world-leading expert on this, and this is Richard Zach, and he has published fantastic historical papers on this, but also kind of technical papers on the logic on epsilon logic. There's one great paper by Zach and Moser on where they give a modern kind of presentation of Hilbert's epsilon logic and these two theorems, these two conservativity theorems. So I won't say more here, but I suggest that you look at Richard's work on this. Kind of regardless of the kind of technical details, two philosophical kind of points about Hilbert's program are important, I think, especially if one tries to compare Hilbert with Carnap's later work. And the one thing I already mentioned is the kind of instrumentalism that you can ascribe to Hilbert. This has been sometimes been called a methodological instrumentalism, and I think that's a fitting kind of assessment of what Hilbert is actually doing. Several scholars have focused on this or have developed such an instrumentalist reading of Hilbert, including Kitcher, Giaquinto, Sieg, Detlefsen, and others. But really, I think the point is summed up very nicely in Richard Zach's Stanford Encyclopedia entry on Hilbert's program. So here's the quote. Hilbert's position must be understood as a methodological instrumentalism. A successful execution of the proof-theoretic program would show that one could pretend, sorry, as if mathematics was meaningless. And the emphasis is really on the as if. So a conservativity proof or a consistency proof would allow one to be an instrumentalist about these formal parts of mathematics, or at least treat them as if high mathematics was formal. That's the idea, and I think that's a good interpretation of Hilbert, as I said, and it, I think, also connects Hilbert's philosophical ideas with what you find in Carnap some years after the Hilbert program. Right. So this is the. So I said two philosophical points. This is the first philosophical point. So Hilbert's instrumentalism. The other point I wanted to mention briefly is the fact that Hilbert's program and this instrumentalist program, if you understand it that way, didn't kind of come out of the blue, but there is an intellectual context for Hilbert's program, and in particular, there are similar, comparable instrumentalist projects or reductionist projects that were developed more or less at the same time as Hilbert's program. And Hilbert, in fact, as we know, was quite perceptive to forms of instrumentalism in physics, for instance. So there are well-known passages in Hilbert 27, I think, where he actually compares his own proof-theoretic program or draws an analogy to instrumentalist approaches in physics, for instance. But the point I wanted to mention here is I wanted to point you to this paper by Marcos Giaquinto on Hilbert's program. It's a bit older, 83. And Giaquinto really makes this kind of connection to other instrumentalist projects. In particular, he mentions the Vienna circle in his paper and makes points to a similarity between Hilbert and the logical empiricists. So here you have Giaquinto commenting on this kind of background or context of Hilbert. He says, it's no accident that the finest philosophical expressions of Hilbert's views, his article of 25 and 27, appear in the period in which the Vienna circle flourished. His program was by contemporary standards a sophisticated expression within philosophy of mathematics of an outlook that was widely accepted in the scientific community of the time. And Giaquinto refers to other reductionist programs, and in particular, he refers to Carnap. So Giaquinto connects Hilbert's programs with contributions to scientific instrumentalism and empiricist reductionism. And as I said, in particular, he mentions Carnap's logical Aufbau in his paper. Okay. Unfortunately, this is the only mention of Carnap's Aufbau here. I know this is an online seminar on reinterpreting the Aufbau, but that's all I have for you here. What I want to do now is look at places in Carnap's work, early work on the logic of science, where it's clear that Carnap took up ideas from Hilbert from the 20s, one has to say. Okay, so unfortunately I won't have more to say on the Aufbau, but maybe we can discuss this connection after the talk. Okay, so here are the two questions that I'm interested in. How was Carnap's work on the logical reconstruction of mathematical and scientific theories influenced by Hilbert's program? And secondly, did Hilbert and Carnap develop similar instrumentalist ideas? So these are the two kind of motivating questions for my comparison. And now, let's look at several points of contact. I should say that I leave out connections of points of contact that are there and that are obvious and that would be very interesting to study and to investigate further. One being the connection to Carnap's logischer Aufbau. As I said, I won't have anything to say there. Another obvious connection between Hilbert and Carnap concerns Carnap's early work on what he calls general axiomatics. So a theory of the axiomatic method that Carnap worked on in the 20s, and where in this project Hilbert was clearly a strong influence. I won't talk about the general axiomatic projects either, but I will focus on three other points of contact if you want. And the first one is not that well known, I think, but it's very interesting, I think. It's a manuscript that Andre Karros and together with Steve Audi in a paper have investigated in detail. So it's an unpublished manuscript written in 29, I think, New Foundations of Logic. So really, I should say, look at Andrew's book, Carnap and 20th Century Thought. This contains a very detailed discussion of this manuscript. And very roughly, the idea here is to, according to Andrew and Steve, is to erect a Hilbertian axiomatic superstructure on a Wittgensteinian basis. So it's and this is true in a way. So it's in a way it's an attempt to synthesize Hilbert's program and Hilbert's formalism with a Wittgensteinian account of logic, basically. So here's what I'm following Andrew's discussion here. Here's what Hilbert says in this manuscript. So he first says that there are meaningful, contentful, logic-free atomic sentences expressing elementary facts. And then a logic is basically consists of formal, meaningless signs and inference rules that can be added to this atomic language. And his central kind of point is that one can, in this extended language, formulate sentences with these new formal signs, for instance, quantifiers. And these sentences, according to Carnap, still have a definite meaning, even though the new signs, the newly introduced signs, such as quantifiers, are formal. But the sentences constructed or formulated in terms of them still have a definite meaning, and meaning is really understood in a Wittgensteinian sense here, in the sense that they express a truth functional description of the world. So as Karros has put it, they have meaning in the sense that they confine the total space of possibilities to certain rows in the truth table of a state description of the world, basically. I mean, I should say that this idea was, of course, not successful and it was abandoned, but I think this manuscript is interesting for several reasons, and one is that this is the place where Carnap explicitly refers to Hilbert's program and Hilbert's formalism and engages with it very early on in his career. So this is 29. And in fact, he, this is a long quote, but it's central. He really refers to Hilbert's formalism and gives it a twist, so to speak. So here's what he said. He calls his own position radical formalism, and he describes this as follows. He says, formalism says, in the sense of Hilbert, we want to introduce certain signs and formulas without giving their meaning, to make mathematics a uniform, complete system. And then his own position, we now extend that to a radical formalism. It is permitted to add to those atomic sentences that express the most basic knowledge arbitrary formulas that are treated like atomic sentence, and they consist completely or partially of new signs. Think of quantifiers. And secondly, arbitrary contentful transformation rules of inference. And then he kind of repeats this point from before, that these formulas formulated in terms of these new formal signs, nonetheless, or let me read this, it is to be shown here that nonetheless every formula that can arise from this has a definite meaning, as it is either a tautology or a meaningful proposition that is a truth function of the atomic sentences. So this is the basic Wittgensteinian idea. And then he says, hence, despite radical formalism, the demand for meaningfulness is fulfilled. So this is, I take it, on the one hand, the direct engagement with Hilbert's program, but with the twist that in his account, some form of, or his idea is that some form of meaningfulness of the new theoretical statements are given or are preserved. Yeah, so this is also in this context, more explicitly, even he actually refers to Hilbert, right? And Hilbert's notion of ideal sentences or ideal propositions. So he says here in a related manuscript, if now to introduce the infinite one adjoins ideal propositions, Hilbert, that is, writes down formulas that have no contentful meaning, but permit us to derive the mathematics of the infinite, then we have once again been able to determine the meaning of the signs first introduced as meaningless, by investigating for which logical constants the formulas would become tautologies. So a direct engagement with Hilbert's formalism. By the way, these are all quotes that you can find in Karas's book. So Andrew has discussed these formulas. Okay, I won't go into this, but it's interesting to see that he has a kind of conservativity constraint to justify the introduction of these new symbols, ideal symbols also. This is very interesting, but I won't have time to go into this. The other important thing is that his type of formalism, so Carnap's type of account of formalism in 1929 is understood as more general than Hilbert's approach. That's why he calls it a radical formalism. And it's radical in the sense that it's not limited to mathematical or logical axioms, but it allows for the introduction of any kind of theoretical postulates or axioms. So he calls it any sort of non-empirical axioms are okay here, including axioms of inductive logic, for instance. Oh, sorry. So this is really a generalization of Hilbert's position that Carnap at least had in mind here. Okay, so summing up this first kind of point of contact with Hilbert's program, what you find in the 1929 manuscript is a first attempt to apply a kind of Hilbert formalism to the philosophy of science and the study of theoretical languages. I think this is really crucial. So this is really crucial that Carnap came up with the idea of the study of theoretical languages by looking at Hilbert, what he took to be Hilbert's formalism. But there's, as I said, a central difference to Hilbert already in 1929, and this is the claim, at least, that ideal science are not meaningless, or statements involving this science are not meaningless, but they have a kind of definitive but incomplete meaning, in a sense. I think this is really a constant or an invariant in Carnap's thinking of theoretical languages that one can see. I'll come to that in a couple of minutes. Also in his very late mature work on theoretical languages. Okay, so this is the first kind of point of contact. Now, I actually don't want to say too much on the second point. This is the obvious influence of Hilbert on Carnap's account of syntax languages, or Wissenschaftslogik in his logical syntax of language. Here the term Wissenschaftslogik, or at this time the term Wissenschaftslogik is first introduced as a kind of replacement for epistemology, and logic of science for Carnap at that time is the logical analysis of the concept and sentences of science. So it's nothing else but the logical syntax of the language of science. And I'll skip the kind of more detailed discussion of what he means by that, but just to point out that in this account of Wissenschaftslogik, or philosophy of science as logical syntax of scientific languages, is strongly inspired by Hilbert. So one knows from his diaries, thanks to Christian Damberg, that Carnap read Hilbert at the time. So this is 32, where he was reading the first volume of Foundations of Mathematics. No, that cannot be actually. That's okay. I have to check that again. Sorry about that. That cannot be in terms of the timeline. But looking at the logical syntax book, the influence is explicit, right? So he says the point of view of the formal theory of language or syntax was first developed by Hilbert in his Metatheoretics. And then this is from the introduction, and then in the first chapter he says, Metatheoretics, when considered in the widest sense, is the syntax of the mathematical language. So it's really a continuity between Hilbert's approach and his logical study of scientific languages. Okay, so that's the second point of contact. That's the obvious one could say. But then there's also there scattered remarks in Hilbert's late or mature work on the logic of science, or logical theory reconstruction, where Hilbert comes in again, I think. So this is clear, for instance, if you look at his Dialectica paper from 58, observation language and theoretical language, or if you look at his lecture published by Psillos from 59, theoretical concepts in science. And as you know, I guess one of the central ideas here is, it's called the syntactic reconstruction of theories. So a scientific theory is presented as a set of statements. It's presented axiomatically in a theoretical language that has, which signature is kind of divided or bipartitioned into a observational vocabulary and a bunch of theoretical terms, T-terms. And then one crucial idea, I won't discuss this, is of course the ramification of such a theory. So the idea is the theory consists of theoretical postulates and so-called correspondence postulates or bridge postulates. And then you have a bunch of theoretical terms and a bunch of observational terms and predicates. And the ramification is the method of eliminating the theoretical terms by substituting them by existentially quantified variables of a given type and order, so to speak. This was crucial for Carnap, as we all know. And what's really interesting, I think, is that the central result, theoretical result related to the introduction of the Ramsey sentence is a kind of conservativity result. So this is this famous theorem, I think, if I'm not mistaken, first published by Carnap in 58, but it was kind of this is a story that it was kind of reinvented and actually goes back to Ramsey himself. But the idea is that for any statement phi in the observational language, if phi is derivable in TC, then it is also a consequence of the Ramsey sentence. So in one way, or I read in this direction, the result shows really that a theory TC is a conservative or is conservative over the Ramsey sentence, which is expressed in the observational language. And this can be assessed philosophically in terms of an instrumentalist viewpoint. So one natural way to read this, I think Carnap was not explicit on this, but I would be very interested in discussing this with you. One natural way to read this is as a conservativity result. So what this it allows you is to be an instrumentalist about the use of theoretical terms or theoretical language in which this theory is formulated. So in other words, one can understand the Ramsey sentence of a theory as Tim Button and Sean Walsh have put it, an object language statement of conservation based on this result. So this is one, I think, interesting point where one could find a kind of link to Hilbert's earlier work. And then secondly, the second philosophical point, much more explicit in Hilbert, is again related to this notion of partial or incomplete interpretation of the theoretical terms or theoretical vocabulary that Hilbert endorses. So here is again this Carnap's famous Dialectica paper, where I won't read this, but he just what he says here is that his approach is kind of close to how Hilbert understood mathematical languages, and Hilbert's mathematical approach. And then he says that Hilbert too has emphasized the analogy between a construction of a system of theoretical physics, or theory of physics, and the formalist construction of mathematics. Both can be regarded as uninterpreted calculi. So again, this focus on a formalist stance. But here again, this is the point I wanted to mention. Here again, you find this focus on this partial interpretation view of theoretical terms. And this is the idea, famous idea in Carnap, that theoretical terms and sentences have a partial or indirect interpretation that is given in terms of the theoretical postulates, which kind of implicitly define them, and in terms of the correspondence postulate, which connect the theoretical entities to, or the theoretical terms to observational terms. And then already here, he says that the meaning or the specification of meaning of theoretical terminology is never complete, but it can always be refined and further strengthened if you extend the theory by new postulates. But I think that the point I want to really emphasize here is that this idea of partial interpretation is really an invariant in Carnap's thinking about theoretical languages, and it's a point where he explicitly draws or makes a difference to Hilbert's formalism in his view. So I think he takes this to be a central difference to Hilbert. According to Carnap's partial interpretation view, theories provide an indirect and incomplete interpretation of the theoretical vocabulary. Okay, this leads me to the kind of final and fourth point of contact. But now I wanted to ask you if there's still enough time, how much time I have left, or whether I should stop here.
No, you still have 20 minutes, because we started around 10 minutes later. So
I should be able to finish up in 5 or 10 minutes max.
That's fantastic.
Okay, super. Okay, so right. So this is the. Let's briefly kind of recap. So I think there are 3 interesting points of contact between Hilbert and Carnap. One is this 1929 manuscript, where he first discusses Hilbert's formalism in detail, in quite some detail, even though it remained unpublished. The second is, of course, the logical syntax. That's well known. And the third point of contact concerns his Carnap's later mature view of logical theory reconstruction. And here one joint or shared idea, I think, has to do with conservativity, although that's a kind of more of a loose analogy or loose comparison, where the influence of Hilbert becomes absolutely clear again is in Carnap's very last contribution to the logic of science, and this is the so-called epsilon term reconstruction of theories. So let me say a couple of things about this to conclude. The 2 sources for this are these two texts. So there is the lecture, Theoretical Concepts in Science, which was edited by Psilos. And then there's this very late paper by Hilbert. It's called On the Use of Hilbert's Epsilon Operator in Scientific Theory. So it's really what he does here. So very briefly in the Santa Barbara lecture 59, what he does there is discuss the ramification and first introduce an idea to explicitly define theoretical terms via this epsilon symbol. And of course, he refers to Hilbert's work on the logic of epsilon terms and the epsilon calculus. So he says here, in order to give those explicit definitions of theoretical terms, I make use of a logical constant that has been introduced by Hilbert, and extensive use of it has been made in the work by Hilbert and Bernays in the Foundations of Mathematics, second volume, 39. Yeah, he says it here. It's discussed in great detail at the beginning of the second volume. And he actually, I won't read this, but he actually, in this Santa Barbara lecture, explicitly discusses the epsilon theorems, Bernays and Hilbert's epsilon theorems here. How you can get rid or eliminate epsilon terms in proofs of theorems of real statements. But how does he use it in the context of philosophy of science? So this is cashed out in most detail in this 61 paper, where he also talks about a useful application of the epsilon operator in the formulation of theories in empirical science. And the basic idea is this. So he starts again from this purely syntactic presentation of theories as axiom systems in a language with both theoretical terms and observational terms. Then he uses the method of ramification, and then he reintroduces theoretical terms by definition, by explicit definition, in an expanded language of expanded theoretical language, expanded by the epsilon symbol. And very roughly what he does is he takes this, call it the small t, to be the tuple of all theoretical terms. And then this tuple is kind of defined holistically as that epsilon term picks out an arbitrary tuple of extensions for these things if this theory is consistent, And then based on this kind of global definition of theoretical terms, he specifies the TIs individually. And the central idea here is concerns the semantics of epsilon terms, namely this kind of choice functional interpretation of such terms. I think he in the 61 paper Carnap refers to us and others for choice semantics for such terms. And for him, it's this semantic interpretation of this Hilbert symbol is really the crucial idea from a philosophical point of view. So there are two kind of motivations for the explicit definition of theoretical terms. One, this has been pointed out by Michael Friedman, is to once these terms are reintroduced, scientific reasoning becomes much more easier and is facilitated compared to the case where you have to reason without theoretical terms. So it's a way to mimic informal reasoning with implicitly defined theoretical terms. And the second point is a semantic one. It's to give a non-holistic atomistic specification of these theoretical terms. So it's in a way to specify the meaning of these terms. And here's what Carnap has to say about the semantics of such terms. So as I said, the main motivation for him concerns their semantic interpretation. And Carnap says, again referring to Hilbert Bernays, he says in 61, the symbol epsilon was intentionally introduced by Hilbert as an indeterminate constant. Its meaning is specified only to the extent that any non-empty set has exactly, this should be one representative, and that this representative is an element of the set. If the set has more than one element, then nothing is said as to which of the elements it is the representative. So it picks out an arbitrary one. And this is cashed out in terms of choice functions. So Hilbert Carnap himself says the epsilon operator expresses an unspecified or a global selection function, so a choice function. Okay, so this choice functional semantics for epsilon terms and its use in Carnap's context of this epsilon reconstruction of theories can be spelled out more systematically, but I won't do this here. I just, to kind of conclude, want to emphasize again this point on the partial interpretation view of theories that Carnap held still in 61, so very, very late. He says here again, the T terms have no direct interpretation. What interpretation they possess is given to them by the correspondence postulates and the T postulates, and this interpretation is incomplete, as he says in the Dialectica paper of 58, because the scientists can always add new axioms or new postulates and specify the meaning of the theoretical terms. So this is really, this kind of indeterminacy or semantic indeterminacy is really crucial here again, and it's taken from Hilbert. Okay, that's basically it. So summing up, I think, I tried to show that Hilbert's program formed an important background for Carnap's Wissenschaftslogik. I think one can argue that Hilbert and Carnap developed similar instrumentalist views concerning mathematical and scientific languages. There are two shared ideas. I think one is a distinction between a contentful, inhaltlicher, or interpreted part and the formal part of a language. And secondly, although this is less clear in Carnap, at least, the reference to notions of conservativity to justify the instrumental use of formal theoretical vocabulary. And then finally, I think there's one important difference that was crucial to Carnap, and that Carnap really pointed out at several points in his intellectual career as a big difference to Hilbert, and this is what's now called his partial interpretation view of scientific theories. Yeah, and that's it. So I will end sharing the screen and end the presentation. Yeah, okay.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. So now we have the usual 5 minutes break. So
okay,
let's take a rest, and we resume around 11:41.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, so we can resume our meeting. So we have questions already in the queue. So Rick, the first one.
There, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Georg. That was wonderful. I'm going to mention Hilbert in a couple of weeks, and I hope to say, I can't even attempt to say half as much, half as well. So thank you very much for that public talk. The notions of meaningfulness and meaninglessness figure very prominently in all of those discussions. But I'm not always sure what meaning means or meaningfulness means. I mean, they're even at the theoretical level, even for the grandest sorts of claims in mathematics, and there are rules for the use of these terms, for the use of some sentences. We know how they relate to one another. What is there a worry about their meaningfulness? And the same question should be put on the flip side of that about finite mathematics and the observational part of our scientific commitments. What's meant by saying, well, they have content, they have meaning, they're not suspect in some way. I mean, it seems to me that observational claims could be partially interpreted. I mean, there are cases where we don't know whether to use an observational sentence or not. The rules don't tell us. So, and in that sense, even observational claims can be partially interpreted. So I just want you to say a little bit more about what's the question that arises for the infinitary part of mathematics in theoretical terms that doesn't arise for the finitary part and the observational part of our theoretical terms.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. It's nice, great to see you. Thanks for the question. I think this is a big question. How meaning in a formalist account, what meaning can be here? And I mean, I think I cannot answer this satisfactorily for Carnap. So now concerning the theoretical parts of a language, I don't yet fully understand what Carnap meant by definite meaning in the context of his 1929 lecture. What is Wittgensteinian account? What he means there? What he means there? I still have to look into this. But I think what's interesting is what he means by partial or indirect interpretation of theoretical statements in the more mature work in philosophy of science. And again, he's not fully explicit here, there, of course, as well. But the idea seems to be, at least that's how I see it, that so you have the observational part of that language, and that has a direct interpretation in the word, or so to speak. And then there are theoretical statements. Those are those statements that contain the theoretical terms, which are introduced as interpreted or as formal signs, formal symbols, and they receive an indirect interpretation or partial interpretation. And this interpretation or semantic interpretation is indirect in the sense that the meaning is specified in terms of both in terms of the theoretical postulates, I think. So in a sense, meaning of those statements is axiomatic meaning. It's determined by the axioms that implicitly define these terms, and also it's determined partially, at least, by the correspondence postulate, so by the relations to the observational vocabulary. How precisely, how Carnap understood that at the time, I mean, I think he doesn't get fully explicit on this. There are, of course, kind of more recent reconstruction of Carnap. So think of Holger Andreas's work on a kind of syntactic view of theories, where Holger gives this modal account of the semantics of theoretical languages. So it's basically a supervaluationist semantics for a theoretical language. That's one way, I think, to cash out this Carnap's notion of indirect interpretation. Another way one could go or adopt, I think, I haven't presented this today, or I haven't talked about this today, but one can, of course, try to make precise Carnap's talk about semantic indeterminacy of theoretical terms in the 1961 paper. So when Carnap talks about the explicit definition of theoretical terms based on this epsilon symbol. So one can try to cash out meaning in terms of a choice functional semantics and try to make this Carnap's idea of indirect and partial interpretation precise in terms of this choice functional semantics. Yeah, these are two ways, I think, to make precise what Carnap had in mind here, to give two explications of that. How Carnap himself viewed this, I'm curious to hear what you would say about his understanding.
Please unmute yourself, Eric.
No, you're still.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Now.
I think I have a better understanding of Carnap's answer than I have of the question that it was designed to answer. And this is always a problem. But I'm not sure what itch is that Carnap was trying to scratch. So as I say, I understand his answers a little bit better than I understand the question that they're designed to answer. So that doesn't call for some long answer on your part, because I'm just giving you the autobiographical remark. I'm confused, as I usually am.
Yeah, I think it's one of the. I mean, I think it's one. It's as I said. I think this partial interpretation view of Carnap, or however you want to call it, this is really a central theme that runs through his work, and I was really surprised to see this already in this manuscript from 29 that Andre and Steve Audi have worked on. And the basic idea, I take it, is this, right? So you have a language where one part has a unproblematic semantic interpretation, or you take it to be unproblematic, and then you have an extensions of that language by symbols that are formal, that are non-interpreted, and you still want to ascribe meaning very generally to statements in the expanded language, so statements containing these formal terms. And how do you do this? I think this was what's a partial or indirect interpretation. So yeah, and as I said, I mean, I think this is a general question. Regarding Carnap's work, I think the work done by Holger Andreas, for instance, is one way to cash this out formally in terms of a supervaluationist semantics, for instance. I don't know if this helps.
Thank you.
Okay, so if you have follow-up, Rick, we can do that later on if you want. So now we have a question from Richard Zach. Hi, Richard. Nice to see you again.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. I was going to ask you the same question that Rick asked, but that you already said you don't have an answer to, namely, what did Carnap have in mind when he said that he can give meaning to the ideal things in the 29 paper?
Yes.
And he said it's sort of, like the meaning is given as a truth function of the atomic things. But the ideal stuff is, of course, like unbounded quantifiers, right? So, and this is 2 years before Abran, so the best sort of account that we could have of how to give a meaning for quantifiers in terms of truth functional combinations of atoms would be Abran's theorem. So I mean I looked at that paper a long time ago.
Okay.
And I also couldn't figure out what he had in mind. And I guess I mean this is not really working towards a question, but a comment. I mean it's one thing to say, well, here's how these sentences become meaningful. You interpret them as truth functional combinations of atoms, and another thing to actually make that work. And I don't think it can be made to work. And as far as I remember, it's not. He didn't make it work in that paper. But here's sort of a question, because you're talking about my favorite topic, which is the epsilon calculus. Both in Hilbert's paper and in Ackermann's first attempted consistency proof using the epsilon calculus in 25, I think those are the only things that Carnap would have available in terms of the epsilon calculus in the 20s. Does he talk about the epsilon calculus at any point before the entry in the diary that you mentioned?
Yeah, on this second question, I don't think so. I'll have to check again. But I remember when I worked on this Santa Barbara lecture and his epsilon reconstruction, I looked through the diary and in search for discussions of epsilon logic, and it's really it's fairly late that you can in the diary you find entries where he says, but really in the 50s or end of 50s, really, where he says, "Oh, I picked up again Hilbert Berners 39 and read through this, and the epsilon theorems are really interesting." And so this idea, I mean, came really late, and I think, I mean, I have to check again. I think this is so in the late 50s. This is when he starts thinking about the epsilon. I'll have to check again. I mean, maybe I missed something, but if I remember correctly from my last check of the diary, it's not used before in the early work, or not even this mentioned. But okay, I have to check again. So that's from my memory. And on the first point, yeah, I think, I mean, I also want to look more closely at the 29 manuscript, and also the couple of talks that Carnap gave at that time on this topic. So there's the talk that he gave in Prague, I think, on, let me check. Yeah, this talk, no, sorry, in Warsaw, it's called on the tautological character of inference, and it's closely related to the 29 manuscript. So I still have to do that. I also would be interesting to see if it discusses quantifiers, for instance, explicitly in this paper. I haven't done this work yet.
Okay, so Richard, do you have a follow-up?
No, thank you.
Okay, so then we can move to the next question from our co-host, Katerina.
Hi, Georg. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks. It was great. Yeah, just a suggestion about how to interpret this distinction between interpreted symbol and partial interpreted symbols. This paper, which is rather interesting, from 1929, could we explore the strategy of looking at the Aufbau's distinction between objects and quasi-object? Because in that case, I think we still have the distinction between an interpretation and a partial interpretation. And moreover, this distinction is not absolute. I mean, there is not something that is absolutely interpreted and something that is absolute partially interpreted, but it is an iterated distinction. So this was just a suggestion. Maybe it could be interesting to bridge the gap between the 1929 paper and the Aufbau according to this object quasi-object distinction. Although, as Christian Dambuck was reminding me of yesterday, Aufbau was finished by 1926, as I remember, if I remember correctly. But probably this could be a strategy to find some other interesting views about this 1929 paper. Thanks.
Georg, sorry, I have muted you to avoid the echo when someone else is making a question, so you need to unmute yourself. I apologize for that.
Thanks. Sorry, I didn't see that. Thanks, Katerina. Well, that's very interesting. I haven't thought about this. So the suggestion is to look at Carnap's discussion of quasi-objects in the Aufbau and how they, what would be a connection to a kind of semantic understanding of statements about these objects. Can you, I'll have to read up on this again.
Yeah, I mean, there
curious.
you have, yeah, I mean, there you have, I mean, obviously the elementary experiences, they are objects. And then you have the similarity circles that are quasi-objects, but then similarity circles become objects for the construction of quality classes. So, and there too, Carnap uses the terminology of complete and incomplete symbols. Now I should be more precise there, but I didn't remember it perfectly. But yeah, that's the point. But what was interesting, I think, that is that at least in the Aufbau, if we take this object quasi-object distinction, then this interpretation and partial interpretation is a relative distinction. Yeah, at least. So, I mean, similarity circles are quasi-objects with respect to the elementary experiences, but then they are object with respect to the quality classes. And and there, Carnap uses the terminology of complete and incomplete symbols. But for this terminology, I should check the Aufbau again. Yeah.
Sorry, Georg, I muted yourself. I muted you again. Sorry.
Sorry. Thanks, Katerina. This is helpful. I'll definitely look up what he says about complete and incomplete symbols. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, there is something there. We should check. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Great. So we have the next question from Thomas Huber.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk and the overview, and especially for drawing our attention to this 1929 project of Carnap's, which I'm afraid my question will come back to that. And in fact, I may be asking something which you've already have answered, but I'm fascinated by this, what you said, this erecting a Hilbertian structure on a Wittgensteinian basis. So, okay, so the basis are these atomic sentences, but what I'm particularly worried about or curious about is how Carnap thought of the superstructure. Now there is this, whatever, all propositions are truth functions of the elementary propositions, but as we know, there's different versions of how to understand precisely this proposition 5 of the Tractatus. At one point, Ramsey and Wittgenstein thought they could handle universal quantifiers as infinite conjunctions, but then I don't know what, at 32 or 33, Wittgenstein then declared that was a terrible mistake, etc., etc. And that sort of reflected in how verificationism is understood in certain parts of the Vienna Circle around that time. So I'm just wondering, is there any indication from that manuscript in 29 how Carnap understood universal quantification, whether he took it to be a, infinite conjunction, or whether he thought that was restricted, or?
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah, that's a very good question. I would love to answer, but I don't know yet. I haven't checked this. I think there is a manuscript, either the 29 or one of the surrounding talks that he gave, where he actually discusses quantifiers. But I don't have this right now. I think I looked at this at some point, but I cannot give you any details. Okay. This is still, I mean, as what Richard said before, I think what's clear is that this project wasn't successful. It was abandoned right after he wrote. I think this is this manuscript that he wrote in Davos during this Davos meeting. And from what I've read from Andrew's book and Steve Audi's and Andrew's paper, this was abandoned eventually. But it would still be interesting to look at the details, and I haven't done this yet. And especially, I think if I remember correctly, there is a part where it talks about quantifiers and precisely what the question you asked would be interesting to find out. That's still work to be done. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. But what we can take away is that this manuscript is early 29 then, sort of.
That's a good question. By the way, I should say again that
it's all in there.
That's the source, right? I don't have so far anything original to say on this. So it's all based on Andrew's books and Steve Audi's and Andrew's paper. But Andrew says that there's this loose sketch of this manuscript, Grunddisziplin, which Carnap wrote down in Davos in April 29.
April, okay.
April 29, when he was attending the Europäische Hochschultage, the famous Davos meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
I cannot say more, but yeah. But I think it's definitely worth investigating this a bit further, if just to kind of see how limited the position really is that kind of thought about it, and how he thought about to deal with quantifiers or statements containing quantifiers.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Actually, Richard writes in the in-call messages that is March 27th.
Okay.
Might be a different manuscript though. The one that I'm looking at is Neue Grundlegung der Logik. Davos, 27th March 29.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll have to look again at Andrew's book, but this is what Andrew wrote, April 29 in Davos. But yeah, we check.
Okay, so if there is no follow-up, we can move on to the next question. So, Eric.
Oh.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Hi, thanks very much for your talk. I found it really interesting. I want to go back to Richard's question from the beginning about meaning and meaninglessness. It's less a question, more sort of a general suggestion in that connection. So I think in connection with Hilbert, there's a similar question. What does he mean by meaning and meaninglessness? At least I've always had that question. And that makes me wonder how close Carnap is to Hilbert in that respect, in terms of the idea of meaninglessness. And I would think in Hilbert's case, the background is the foundational debates and classical mathematics or formalism versus intuitionistic mathematics and so on. So it has something to do with the infinite and things like that. How similar is that to the debate Carnap is involved in? And therefore, how similar is the notion of meaninglessness? That may be one way to look at it. I don't have any more specific suggestion or question about that.
Thanks, Erich. Yeah, that's. So the question is, yeah, the suggestion is to see how Hilbert understands formality in these central papers from the 20s and see how his understanding is related to Carnap.
I mean, does he say anything about that, for example, specifically? My sense is actually that they are not very close, but I'm not sure on that particular issue.
Well, I mean, thanks for that point, for that remark. I think there are several things one can say. I mean, one on the understanding of formality. One point is that Carnap at different points in time explicitly characterized Hilbert as a kind of formalism. And so he does that in 29, arguably, where he contrasts his radical formalism from Hilbert's position, from Hilbert's formalism. But then much later, for instance, the quote I had on the slide but didn't read in the Dialectica paper, so different context in philosophy of science, that's 1958, where he again discusses Hilbert's understanding of what he calls Hilbert's formalist construction of mathematics and the idea that logical mathematical systems are introduced as what he calls it uninterpreted calculi. That's from 58. So at least in text, he refers to Hilbert's this kind of, or it has this understanding of formalism. But then I think more interestingly is whether or not more interesting is first what Hilbert's formalism really is, what position that is, and I take it. I take it that it's really a form of methodological instrumentalism or methodological formalism, as Richard has investigated this extensively in several publications. And the question is whether Carnap has something similar, whether Carnap has a similar instrumentalist account of formalism. So I think that's the interesting philosophical question. Just on the level of calling Hilbert a formalist, I think you find several passages in Carnap's works where he draws that or does that, uses that label. But I think what's interesting is if there's similar instrumentalist ideas or instrumentalist ideas that you can find both in Hilbert and in Carnap.
Maybe one quick follow-up. So I tend to read Hilbert also as an instrumentalist formalist, or I've been convinced by people like Richard and Wilfried Sieg. But then what does the appeal to the meaninglessness do? Does that do anything additional? That would be sort of the question. If you read it as instrumentalist, in a sense, then that's less crucial, that question. But what does it still do? What's the work it still does to call something meaningless there? That's sort of the question I have myself.
Yeah. So I mean, I take it that the interesting what's interesting about this instrumentalist reading of Hilbert is that you have what's called a reductive instrumentalism. So you can be an instrumentalist about the formal or some parts of your mathematical language on the condition that you have shown that this part is consistent or is conservative, is a conservative extension. So kind of it's a based on a proof theoretic argument that it's safe to use this in a way. And this is the interesting kind of formalism, I think, and my hunch is that that you find a similar idea in Carnap at various places in his work. I don't know if it's very informal, very loose. Yeah.
Okay, so there are some updates in the call messages, so to speak. So Christian confirmed Richard correct date is March 27, 1929. So thank you, Christian, for the documents. Very professional. So you sent us the evidence there. Okay, and then I don't know, Richard, you want to go on and read what you are suggesting there, because you are suggesting there are actually more than one mention of the epsilon in this document.
Yeah, I just found it in one document, which I posted the link to, and thanks Christian for that, for digitizing it.
Thanks a lot. That's very interesting. So I was wrong about this. What's the context here? Have you checked this?
It's well, I haven't read it in detail now, but the title is Feigls Vorschläge zu meinem Manuskript Metalogik.
Okay,
so I guess
interesting.
This is the early version of the syntax, the Metalogic manuscript, which Carnap sent around to basically everyone. I'm also sort of surprised that there's no correspondence with Bernays, but and also because he said that there's a diary entry where he received the Grundlagen in 1932, 2 years before it was published. But it's very possible that Bernays sent it to Gödel and then asked him to hand it to Carnap when he sees him next, and then send it back, right? That was sort of the, we didn't have PDFs and email then, so it was basically, here's the one copy I have, please round robin it and send it back to me with comments.
Georg, you need to unmute yourself. This time you did by yourself. I didn't.
Yeah, I self-muted myself. So it's actually true that Carnap read Grundlagen 1 in May 1932. Is this, Richard? Because I had this on my slides, and then when I read it, I thought this must be mistaken, but It's a
Well, I don't know, because I don't think there's, like, I didn't see a correspondence in the Carnap papers, and I didn't see correspondence in the Bernays papers between the two. But it's still possible that he got a hold of the manuscript for Grundlagen in 32.
I have to check that entry again from Christian's transcription. Yeah.
Okay, so do we have other questions? We have other 5 minutes, so if you want to jump into the discussion, this is the right time. Well, if not, we can conclude it here. So thank you so much, Georg. It was a really fascinating, and thank you so much. So I think we will hear again on this subject. Oh, there is a question. Sorry,
Another question.
I missed no, sorry, from Nata Young.
No,
sorry, I just want to say thank you. Sorry.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
It was the reaction. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, sorry.
Hi, Nata.
Hi.
So thank you everybody for being here. So we are looking forward to the next talk. That is when is exactly, Katerina?
April the 9th with Rick Chris.
Okay.
Oh, Rick, is your turn. Okay, so we are excited to have you. Okay.
Exactly. Looking forward very much.
Looking forward to that. Okay. Thank you everybody. Thank you,
Great,
Georg.
Georg. Thanks so much.
Richard,
It was
Eric,
fantastic.
Thomas, Rick. And thank you, Robert Tierney, who worked with me, and he helped us with this organization this time. So we will meet next time. Thank you so much.
Great. Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Nice day.
We can stop the
Sì, aspetta.
video recording.
Interrompi registrazione.